Hi, I'm Bearheart, and this is Kirsten.
Howdy.
And behind the camera and at the controls, we have Ricky.
Hi, Ricky.
This episode is about growing up in Hollywood. And where I grew up, I think a lot of people would consider to be Hollywood. My dad worked at a movie studio, and I was within distance to ride my bike there when I was a kid. But in actuality, while I was born within the borders of Hollywood. The hospital that I was born at was technically in Hollywood. But where I grew up was in North Hollywood, which is on the other side of the Hollywood Hills in the San Fernando Valley, which for a lot of people is simply the Valley.
The Valley. Is that where they get like the Valley Girl?
Well, the Valley Girl was Moon Zappa, and I'm wearing a Frank Zappa hat today.
Wow.
The Valley Girl was Moon Zappa, and the story is that she wasn't seeing a lot of her dad because he was always in his studio working. His studio was at home. And at the time, they were still living in a log cabin. They lived in this log cabin in the Hollywood Hills. And so she wrote a note and she slipped it under the door to his studio saying something to the effect of, "Hi, I'm Moon Zappa. I'm your daughter, and I haven't been seeing enough of you. So I was wondering if I could do my Valley Girl voice and on one of your songs so we could spend some time together." And he thought it was a great idea. And he recorded like a few hours of her just doing that Val speak thing into a microphone. And he built a song around it, which was the Valley Girl song. You know, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah, actually, let's have you sing that real quick for us. Give us a little rendition.
Well, the thing is that where I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, I knew people who spoke like that, like regularly spoke like that.
Regularly?
Like regular.
Totally.
Like totally. I knew people who spoke like that. And in the song, she talks about going to the Sherman Oaks Galleria, which is in the valley, and all these places that, are, around where I grew up.
But not Hollywood.
But that's not Hollywood. Hollywood is like the portion of Hollywood Boulevard that's in Hollywood, I'm guessing, but it seems about right to me, is like from Coldwater Canyon to about, Vermont on the east side. And, north to the foothills of the Hollywood Hills and south to maybe Santa Monica Boulevard or maybe Melrose. That would be Hollywood proper. And where I grew up was in the San Fernando Valley, and my dad worked at Universal Studios, which at the time was in North Hollywood, but today it's actually an incorporated city of its own, Universal City.
Right.
And they used to call it Universal City before it was incorporated, but eventually they incorporated the city. And my dad was an editor, a staff editor at Universal Studios, and he mostly did sound effects editing.
So question on that.
Yeah.
Did he make the sound effects? Because
the timing was impeccable on that.
So speaking of sound effects, impeccable timing. Was he the one that makes sound effects? Because you see those videos of people like doing the clickety clocks of the feet and the, water dripping.
So those people are called Foley artists.
Foley.
Foley is the word for that when you make the little sounds, with the coconuts. Yeah.
Whoa.
And those people are called Foley artists, and that's like a whole different thing. What my dad would do is they had a library of sound effects, which the Foley artists had created over all of the many decades of the history of Universal Studios. And he would look at the TV show or the movie that he was working on, and he would see the places where he needed sound effects, and he would, make a list of the sound effects that he needed. Then he would go into their archives and he would find the sound effects that matched, the flavor of the footsteps. Are these high heels? Are they spats? Or are they taps or whatever? And he would find those sound effects, and then he would take them back to his editing bay, and he would splice them into the places where they needed to be. And so it was very tedious work because how this was done. Today it's all done on computers, and you can move the little bits around. You can copy and paste them.
I say like I know, like I do that, but
back then
I understand
what copy
the
and paste meant was that you had a tape recorder and you made a copy, and then you spliced it, with a razor blade, and you literally pasted it in and put protective tape over. I mean, this is where the term copy and paste comes from. And so
You learn
that's
something new
what he
every
did
day.
all day long. And he mostly worked on TV shows like Marcus Welby, MD, and It Takes a Thief, and the Universal TV shows from that time. And I remember those because I remember him working on those. But there were a lot of others. Ironside. These were the popular TV shows at the time that were made at Universal Studios. And this was his job. He did a little bit of the, kind of editing that you think of where you're, cutting the picture. But mostly he was a sound effects editor. And when I was a kid, I was fascinated with that. I was much more interested in that than I was in going to school. And if you've been following along on this podcast, you know how I felt about school. And so instead of going to school, and the school that I was assigned to was Walter Reed Elementary School on Colfax Avenue in North Hollywood. And instead of going to school, I would ride my bicycle a few miles east to the front gate at Universal Studios. There was a guard there, whose name was Scotty, and he knew me.
So you can remember Scotty's name, but you can't remember poor Bob.
That's correct. Scotty was a positive influence in my life.
Got it.
He used to open the gate and let me in to see my dad.
Let me in.
Bob was an asshole. And, I hope that...
Stricken from the record.
So this is a different Bob. Ricky is reminding me that I have Bob on my T-shirt. So we're going to take a little detour. So this is Bob's Country Bunker in Kokomo, Indiana. And that is not a real place. If you're familiar with the movie The Blues Brothers, the original Blues Brothers movie, there's this part where they end up in this country bar and they're playing, and the owner of the bar is Bob. And Jake, who's played by John Belushi, he asks the wife of Bob, I don't remember her name, he asks her, what kind of music do you have here? And her answer was, we have both kinds of music, country and Western. It's like one of my favorite lines from the movie. But so this is a T-shirt commemorating Bob's Country Bunker in Kokomo, Indiana. But that's a different Bob. You're talking about the Bob that I worked for at
the
Merritt,
NASA
the NASA subcontractor. If you want to know more about that Bob, watch the episode on my experience on the Voyager program. I don't know if these are the titles of the episodes, but that would be our 4th episode, and I think it's called Working on Voyager. In any event, this guard was Scotty.
And we love
and
Scotty.
We turn to the thread.
Scotty's our boy.
My story about Scotty, I remember him, and he would always wave to me, and I'd say, hi, Scotty, and he would open the gate, and I would ride my bicycle onto the, which I'm pretty sure he was not supposed to let me onto the lot, but he knew who I was, and he knew who my dad was, and that was all cool. And I think he might have been friends with my dad. I'm not really sure. But there's another story about Scotty told by a famous person, and I only heard this years later, and he talked about going onto the lot at Universal. He's now a famous director, Steven Spielberg, but when he was young, he used to like to hang out on the lot at Universal, and he remembered when he was first making his first films there, including Jaws. He remembered waving at Scotty, the guard at the gate, and he's told stories about Scotty.
So Scotty's the real MVP.
Scotty
here.
is the real deal.
So we can just wrap up the episode
I
at this point,
done.
right? Okay.
I think we're done. I knew Scotty, the guard at the gate at Universal Studios. But once I got past the gate, I would ride my bicycle up, and I would park my bicycle at the foot of these stairs, and from my perspective as being a little kid, I remember these stairs as being very, very tall and very, very, like something from a horror movie, where you climb them up all these millions of stairs. I'm sure if I were to see it today, it would be like a normal flight of stairs.
Right.
That's how I remember it. And way up at the top of the stairs on the left-hand side, there was a door, and it said Don Wyman on the door. It was my dad's editing bay. And I would go in there and I would hang out with him all day, and I would watch him do the splicing of the sound effects. He had this machine called a Moviola, and if you look that up, Moviola, on the internet, you'll see pictures of what it looks like. This was a little machine, and it had a little screen on it, which was basically had a lamp behind the film and a magnifying glass at the top of it, and you would peer into the magnifying glass and you would see the movie, and he would use the moviola and he would find the spot where he was going to splice in the sound effect, and he would shuttle back and forth with the controls, and this was how all of this was done. Then he had another desk where you could lay out the film, and it had little places where you could splice it with a razor blade and where you could tape things together. And that also had like another lamp and another projector with a little thing in front where he could see and hear, exactly where he was and all of that. And he would piece together, and it would all be in pieces, and it would be all taped together. And then he would deliver this to the director of the TV show or the movie or whatever. And then later in the day, they would actually take that and contact print it on a new piece of film and develop it. And later in the day, we would go down to a screening room, and I went with him many times to watch what's called the dailies. And this would be all of the pieces that had been edited together by the editors and the sound effects editors and the music editors and all of that. And we would see a few scenes from the latest TV show that they're working on. And oftentimes in the dailies, there would be, the actors. I would consider them stars, but I think today they would probably be considered kind of B-list because they weren't in movies, they were on TV.
Right.
And TV was always like the bastard stepchild of the movies, at least at that time. Today, TV is becoming very prestige, and a lot of actors are choosing to do, and we got some great TV today that we didn't used to have back in that time. But in that time, it was all very formulaic, and you could pretty much predict what was going to happen. And the production values, they had cardboard sets and all of this. But this was an amazing experience for me. And I didn't realize until years and years later, when I was an adult, and my dad was actually getting really old, and it was just before he died, that I realized how odd it was that he never complained that I wasn't going to school. And that to him, this was like as normal as it was to me to be going up and spending this time together. And I had a great bond with my father. Of all of my family, I was probably closer to my dad than anybody else. And decades later, I realized what that was, is that we were survivors of the same trauma. The things that were going on in my home that eventually chased me away and led me to leave at age of 12, and that were part of the trauma that led me to be as misbehaving and everything in school, and such an outcast and all of this. I mean, some of that is my neurodiversity, and we didn't have diagnoses for autism back then. I diagnosed later in life. We didn't have diagnoses for that when I was a young child, but I realized that a lot of that trauma was stuff that was also going on with my father. My father was as abused as I was, and by the same people. So this was sort of a bonding time for it, and we were both that escape for each other, and that was what created this very unusual but very, very wonderful bond that I had with my dad. Oh, you quelling a little bit back there. There is a place at Universal Studios called the Commissary. And this is where everybody would go to eat lunch. And it was like a cafeteria, and there was like a cafeteria lady, and there were trays, and there were, you would scoop out your food into your trays, and you would take the little plate of mashed potatoes or whatever, and we would go and we would have lunch in the commissary. And the commissary was sort of this egalitarian, you had your movie stars, you had your directors, you had your worker bees.
So Mean Girls.
No,
how
no,
they
there was,
split up the
everybody was,
cafeteria.
yeah, I guess there were probably some of that. But from my eyes, it was this magical place where we all ate lunch with the movie stars. And we often did. We would sit at the same table with some of the people who were, the actors and on the TV shows he was working on, or the other editors or the directors. And one day, one of my favorite memories, one day we're sitting here eating lunch with all of these famous people, and a hush falls on the entire room. Everybody in the room, from the biggest stars to the most nobody of nobodies, all of a sudden, all at the same time, stopped what they were doing and turned and looked at the door. And in walked Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh my gosh.
And
did you know who he was
I
at
knew
the
who
time?
he was. I did not realize until much later in life who he was.
Right, okay.
This is like one of the most celebrated
Wow.
directors in history, and these people obviously knew who he was. At that time, he was towards the end of his film career. He was doing his TV show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Rum-ba-da-da-da-rum-ba-dum, and he was doing that at Universal Studios. And so he walks into the commissary like anybody else to have lunch, but this reaction from everybody, and there was something in me that knew that I was like that something very, very special was happening, and that Alfred Hitchcock meant a lot more to these people than, I just knew him from his famous silhouette.
Yes, the silhouette, yeah. It was a different seeing him straight on.
Well, and you would see him, well, yeah, but he had this pouty lower lip. And of course I'd seen the promos for Alfred Hitchcock Presents, where he would have like a raven on his shoulder or something like that. Yeah, I do have a raven over here. You can see it. It is not on my shoulder, and I'm not going to put it on my shoulder. It's kind of breakable. So that's one of my favorite memories of Universal Studios, along with, of course, saying good morning to Scotty every day, who for some reason really sticks in my memory. I had a friend at the time who I went to school with, and I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly or if I have people and situations mixed up, but he may have been John O. Rosenman. And his father was a composer who wrote music for films and TV shows. Anyway, John O. was his son, and he was one of my few friends. I didn't have a lot of friends. And I'm not really sure that I have all of this straight. It might have been somebody else, but I remember it being John O. And we would ride our bicycles over Laurel Canyon, over into Hollywood proper, and he knew how to get into Paramount Studios. And we would go into Paramount Studios and we would park our bikes, and they had these little electric golf carts that everybody would ride around, to get from one massive stage to another.
Yeah, they do the tours on those golf carts. I mean, they're much bigger now, but...
And you would, park it at the building you're going to, and somebody else would pick it up and take it to the next one. And there are these giant buildings with the sound stages in them. And of course, one of them was where they shot Star Trek. And so we would go and we would peek in and see the soundstage for Star Trek. And later in my life, when they did The Next Generation, by this time I was doing computer work, and I was working on one of the Star Trek films. I was doing computer screens, like Klingon computer screens or something.
Oh, wow.
And I would write the programs that would display. So you tap on it, it looks like you're tapping something.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
Makes sense. And I got to peek into the same soundstage, and it was all dressed up for Star Trek The Next Generation. It was like the main bridge, and I got to walk around on the bridge, and that was spectacular. But me and, if I'm remembering correctly, Jono, we would just race each other around the lot on these golf carts, and it was just hilarious and great fun.
God. How did y'all not get severely injured?
We were made of sterner stuff back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I see how they treat kids today, and they wrap them up in bubble wrap to go to school and shit.
Bubble boy.
We didn't do that, but that was what it was like growing up in Hollywood. In Hollywood during that time.
Air quotes, by the way.
Yeah,
Hollywood.
air quotes Hollywood, because mostly I grew up in the Valley.
The Valley.
I used to ride my bike all over the place, and those of you who know Los Angeles, you know what Laurel Canyon is. And when I look at it today, I'm like, I have no idea how I survived this. But I used to ride my bicycle over Laurel Canyon and go into Hollywood, sometimes also skipping school. I would ride my bicycle over Laurel Canyon and go to movies in Hollywood. And I always loved movies. I know I inherited this love of film from my dad.
Shocker.
But at one point in whatever year it was, they used to open the big movies on Wednesdays during the day. And the opening of the film, the first screenings of the film were Wednesday matinees. And this is like before we had blockbusters like we have today. And I had been anticipating for a long time Stanley Kubrick's 2001. I'd been reading about it. I'd been seeing pictures and magazines of them filming it. And I was super excited to go and see it. And so I cut school that day, and I rode my bicycle over Laurel Canyon, and I went to the Cinerama Dome on a Wednesday afternoon, and I got in line, and I paid my $3 or whatever it was, and I sat like way up close, this monstrous screen, and it was probably the worst possible place I could sit, but I just felt like, this was like the place to be, and saw the first showing of 2001, and I was so absolutely flabbergasted that I got right back in line and went and saw it again.
Was what they predicted in that movie, was that at all true at the time?
Oh, a lot of the things from that film have come true. There's the scene of them on the Discovery spaceship, and they're orbiting Jupiter, and they sit down at this table and they have these flat pads that they watch video on of news broadcasts and such. And today we have iPads.
Wow.
So I think a lot of it came true. They had picture phones. I mean, the picture phone said AT&T on it. And of course, today
that was
the picture
sponsored.
phone is, one of these. But yeah, a lot of that stuff was definitely predicted there. But what was really spectacular, and again, I didn't understand this at the time, but later in life I came to understand it. And to this day, it is my absolute favorite film ever, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. But what was more remarkable about that than anything was that they tried to make space as realistic as they could. And in fact, when the Apollo astronauts finally orbited the moon and saw the Earth for the first time, humans seeing the Earth from that perspective, they were shocked at how much it looked like what they had done in 2001, a few years later. And they had done this before anybody had been out there. But of course, they had Arthur C. Clarke, who's a famous scientist, mathematician, and science fiction author who helped write the script and wrote the novelization. And he had a lot to do with, this is what the Earth would look like from space. The only thing they didn't get right is that the Earth from space, when you actually see it from space, has cloud cover.
Oh, okay.
And in the shots from 2001, it doesn't have cloud cover. You just see the continents and the oceans.
I mean, if that's the only thing that went wrong, I'd say two thumbs way up.
There's this great shot near the beginning of the film after the apes, and near the beginning of the film where you see the Earth rising over the horizon of the moon and the sun rising behind the Earth. And it is just so breathtaking. And, of course, also Sprach Zarathustra is the bum, 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 ba-dum, that's playing in the background. Another story that I know of that again, it's not firsthand, but it's what I've heard, is that the Academy didn't know that the apes were actors in ape suits. And if they had known, they would have been nominated for and probably won Best Costume Design at the Academy Awards, but they thought they were real trained apes. In that opening sequence where you see the apes, those were mimes that they had hired that were professional mimes, and that, had watched films of apes and how they move, and they built these complicated contraptions for them to wear over their heads and the fur and everything. The Academy voters, enough of them didn't realize that was fake to nominate it for an award.
I don't even know how to feel about that. I'm shocked. I'm appalled. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Disappointed.
There's a lot of interesting stories like that. From another one of my favorite films is Fantastic Planet, which came out in '56. I remember that because that's the year I was born. And the score was recorded by these two musicians out of New York who were experimental musicians and experimenting with things like theremins and, electronic musical instruments, way back in the 50s. And it was such a brilliant score, and it's one of my favorite films, partly because of the score. There's no natural instruments. It's all electronic. And they were disqualified from the Academy Awards, actively, literally disqualified, because it was electronic music, and the Academy wasn't prepared to accept that as music. And in fact, in the credits, they weren't allowed to put a musical score by, and instead it put electronic sounds by. Yeah. Hollywood is a weird place.
That's what I'm saying.
So later in life, because I didn't leave LA until I was in my mid-30s. And I did eventually leave. I left because it just wasn't fun anymore. It was just so much work to get from one place to another. And,
they are a big
many of the
public
places,
transportation
they don't
zone.
have public transportation. Or at least they've started to since, but they didn't at the time really have public. When I was a little kid, they had something called the red cars. And downtown LA and throughout that part of town, they had tracks on the streets, and they had these cars that ran on the tracks. They're very much like the cable cars in San Francisco, except instead of being driven by a cable underground, they were electric, and they had these wires overhead with those little, brush things that, and they were painted red, and they were called the red cars. And it was really a great way to get around in downtown LA. That was still around when I was a little kid, and I remember riding on the red cars. But those were gone by the time I was, a teenager or younger. And instead we had freeways, and it became known as a city of freeways. And it's become known as a city of car culture.
I thought Los Angeles was the city of angels.
Well, it's that too.
But now it's the city of freeways.
Although I think the cars drove them off as well.
Yeah, all the way to Orange County.
Yeah, all the way to Orange County. Behind the orange curtain, as we used to call it.
Go Angels, go Halos.
Oh, yeah, those guys. I'm a big baseball fan. I'm a big Dodgers fan since I was a little kid. I worshipped Sandy Koufax as a little kid growing up. So as I grew older, what are you pointing at? Oh, yeah, Justin Turner. Yeah, there's Justin Turner. Third baseman for the Dodgers until now. Now he's a free agent. So as I grew up and eventually left home and started being crazier, eventually I started doing computer consulting work around town in LA. And actually before that, I was doing electronics consulting. And another one of my favorite stories is Todd Fisher, who's better known as Carrie Fisher's brother. He was a bit of an inventor and a bit of a genius, and I'm sure he still is. I mean, I haven't seen him in...
Can you be a bit of a genius?
I guess. I don't know. He was really brilliant, and I really enjoyed working with him. And this is probably 40 years ago. But he was hired by Stevie Wonder to create a talking synthesizer he could press the buttons and it would talk in his ears and give him feedback on what the buttons were that he was pressing. And I was hired to do the speech interface. Todd somehow heard about me and some of the work that I had done, and he hired me to do the speech interface for that. And so we were working in his garage. His sister would come and go, Carrie Fisher, and I got to say hi to her a few times. And this is already, after Star Wars, so we all knew who she was. But she was a whole lot more fun than anybody had. I mean, she always had jokes, and she had this fabulous cackly laugh, and really, really liked her a lot. But the starstruck moment for me was one day when she brought home her boyfriend, Paul Simon.
Oh my gosh.
And, as somebody who'd grown up as a musician, that was very much a starstruck moment for me. And I don't know if I said anything.
I was going to ask, did you shake his hand? Did words come out of your mouth?
I believe I shook his hand. I don't know. He's a little guy. I remember that. But she was little also. I mean, they were about the same size. So.
I have a really hard time. I'm like a classic fangirl or like a woo girl, if you will. So you take me to any function. It doesn't matter if I know who's playing or if I know who's going to be there. I'm going to be their hype man. I'm going to be the one person in the audience cheering louder than the rest of them. So I've had a couple of the reason I asked is because I've had a couple of moments where I've gotten to meet famous people, and I do not
you're
hold
from
my
Texas.
composure at all.
You're from Texas, and I lived in Texas for a while. And at one point when I was living in Texas, we were down in San Angelo. Mm-hmm. And San Angelo, for those of you who don't know, is deep in the heart of Texas.
We'll work on it. Getting
The
that
stars
synced
at
up.
night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas.
Yeehaw!
And we were at a political function of some sort where the governor of Texas was speaking. And I got to meet the governor of Texas, who would later become the president of the United States, George W. Bush. And we were there early because my wife at the time, her father, we were with her father, and he was one of those people that's always 20 minutes early to anything. And so it was just us and W. And nobody called him W at the time. You know.
But you could imagine.
But
you could start it up.
So we just
know?
stood there and had a long conversation with him. And I'll tell you this about George W. Bush. The stupid act is an act.
Oh, absolutely.
He was not stupid. He was coherent. He was literate. He knew how to pronounce words. That whole down home, homeboy, I don't know how to pronounce that word. You know, that was an act, and it got him elected.
So you got to meet Paul Simon. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked.
Yeah, I got to meet Paul Simon. Yeah, we could go off on that other tangent for a long time. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and that was, there were a number of encounters like that over the years, you know, growing up in that area and around those people. My older sister, when she went off to college, she had a boyfriend for a while when she was in college, and his name was Matt Groening, who went on to create The Simpsons. And so, you know, he's like family.
And he's also weirdly predicted lots of different things in the future.
Certainly.
That's going to be a whole other thing.
He was close friends with this guy, who to me is you know, I never got to meet Frank Zappa. I did get to meet his daughter Moon and his son Dweezil. And I have one of Dweezil's guitars hanging on the wall over there.
That's right.
But I should have put it up here.
We should have.
Yeah, I'll put it up here for another one. It's very sparkly, and I'm not sure how it's going to look under the lights and the camera and everything. But we'll put it up there and we'll see.
If anything, it'll just hypnotize.
Yeah. I have earlier memories too, and I'm being reminded by my notes. When I was a teenager and after I had left home, and I lived in various hippie circumstances, what we would call communes and what today you'd probably call something else, several different times during my teenage years. And a bunch of my friends and I, we would pile into a VW bus.
Classic.
Literally pile into a VW bus, and we would go out at night to hear music. And sometimes we would go down to the Sunset Strip, and we would go to the Troubadour, where the house band was a really, really great band called The Doors. And we saw them many times. And Jim Morrison was very, very shy, and he would always stand with his back to the audience and like sing for the band. But even a greater memory for me, because I was never really into pop music until I got older. At that time, being musicians and being in a band, we were much more interested in progressive jazz. And so we would drive all the way down to Hermosa Beach. And if you know the geography of Los Angeles, we were living in Reseda in the San Fernando Valley, and we would drive all the way down to Hermosa Beach. We would go over Topanga Canyon and drive along Mulholland and drive along PCH and go all the way down to Hermosa Beach to a club called the Lighthouse, which it turns out has become legendary for these days when I was going there. But we were young. There was a guy named Norman Granz who was a promoter, and he was trying to keep jazz alive during a period when jazz was on the decline. And he created a record label called Pablo Records, and he had all these great artists: Joe Pass, Herb Ellis, Ray Brown, Oscar Peterson, Ella Fitzgerald, all of these amazing artists. And he would take them on tours around the country, and the Lighthouse was one of their stops. And so every week there were these jazz luminaries playing for, you know, what was ridiculously low amount of money to get in and sit and see them. And the club was often half empty, and we would just sit there by the stage and, you know, jaws open, watching our heroes play. And between sets, we'd get to sit and talk to them. For a long time, I had one of Joe Pass's guitar picks. He used to take his guitar picks and he would literally break them in half so that he could get 2 usages out of them. He played a big-bodied, Joe Pass was one of my big heroes. He would play a big-bodied jazz-style guitar, and I don't remember the model of it, but he put electrical tape over the word Gibson. So, you knew it was a Gibson guitar, but it didn't say Gibson on it. And I asked him why one night, and he says, well, Gibson's never done anything for me. Years later, Gibson produced a Joe Pass, a signature model.
Wow.
Under their Epiphone label, not under their Gibson label. But he took the electrical tape off. So that was really brilliant. There was a time a little bit later when I was maybe in my 20s, and I was in a band that was an Elvis impersonator.
Did you wear the costume?
No. Levy Walker did. Sometimes he would wear the jumpsuit, sometimes he wouldn't.
Was that a hip
His
thrust,
name was
Ricky?
Levy Walker. He was black. He was had this absolutely fantastic baritone voice, much better than mine. And he was opera trained, and he was doing this because apparently there's only like 1 or 2 roles in opera for a black man. And so he would go around doing his Elvis act, called himself King Creole. And we traveled with him some, and we did gigs around LA. And one night we played the Playboy Club in Century City. And after we played, I mean, there's a whole story about when we played this for another episode. But after we played, we're back in the green room, and apparently, as was his tradition, if he was in town, Hugh Hefner came in to meet the band. And this was another time when I was pretty starstruck because, especially as a young, just out of his teenage years,
Yep.
man.
Hugh Hefner was the man.
He was the dude, man. He was the dude.
The guy.
But also, as I learned later in life, he had many flaws, and some of them are rather unforgivable. But he also was a huge champion of freedom of speech, and he was a huge champion of integration. He had his TV show back in the 50s and the 60s, and he would have integrated crowds in his little, mock living room, and he would have integrated. One of my favorite acts that was on his show was Lamper, Hendricks, and Ross. They were a jazz trio of singers. They invented that whole tight harmony jazz thing that we call vocalese today. But, a black man, a white man, and a white woman all on stage together singing was something that was just not allowed in many parts of the country. And his show was actually completely banned in the South. And it wasn't because of the bunnies. It was because of the integrated audience. So, Hef was a mixed bag. And, to this day, I'm really kind of stoked that I got to meet him and shake his hand. And I'm pretty sure I was entirely incoherent at the time.
So you too fangirled.
Oh, yeah. I fangirled a lot of people. I fangirled Stevie Wonder.
You say starstruck.
Although Stevie Wonder never got to see me fangirl. I also got to meet Ray Charles once. I was at a Microsoft event. Bill Gates tried many times to hire me over the years. And every time he tried to hire me, he also pissed me off like the day before. And so I used to build and sell these white box PCs. They called them white box PCs. They were like no brand. We built them ourselves in a little office park in Marina del Rey in Los Angeles. And we would sell them and support them. And a license for Microsoft MS-DOS, which was the operating system at the time, cost us $50 wholesale, which is a lot when we've got like maybe $200-300 worth of parts in the machine. That's like a big chunk. There was another DOS that was DR-DOS, Digital Research, which actually predated MS-DOS and is based on the old CP/M that Bill Gates stole to create MS-DOS, but that's a whole other story. And that cost us $5 wholesale. So we would rather sell people. We charged extra. If they wanted real MS-DOS, we charged them $50 extra, and that's just what it cost us. Well, Bill Gates sued us because by their reckoning, or by their accusation, we were selling PCs and not paying licenses for MS-DOS, And in their mind, there's no alternative. I mean, we had to have been delivering bootleg copies of MS-DOS. So he sued us. And then he tried to hire me. And anyway, I was at one of these events where he was trying to hire me. And the band that they brought in, it was like a party in a ballroom somewhere. Actually, I think it was here in Vegas, in a ballroom. And there was a stage set up in the middle, and we didn't know. There was like a surprise, big surprise. And it was Ray Charles and his full band and the Raylettes. And again, I was totally fangirl, you know, and I did get to meet him. And of course, you know, he'll never remember that. This is what it was like for me growing up in Hollywood and, you know, living there and working there for all those years. Eventually it came to the point where I was doing more computer consulting and I was doing programming consulting. I was living in West LA, and my job that I was contracting at was in Glendale. And if you know the geography of LA, it's like the other end of town. And I would, in order to be able to beat the traffic, I would get up at 5 a.m. and it would take me about 90 minutes to get to Glendale, because beating the traffic is not really a thing in LA.
Ha, ha, ha.
And the ride back, because it was like the middle of the afternoon, would take me 2.5 hours. And this is just like, I don't know, 30 miles. It's not a long distance. And I just got really, really tired of that. And so I went to a newsstand. We used to have these things called newsstands, where they have these things called newspapers. I don't know if you've ever seen one.
I have, and I'm offended. So that you think I haven't.
I'm sorry. Apparently I'm offending Kirsten a lot today. This is like my thing.
No, it's only been like in the last 30 minutes we're being goofy.
But I would go to this newsstand, and I would get all the Sunday papers from all over the world, and I would open to the want ads. We used to have these things. This is, you know, you didn't go online then to find a job. You looked in the newspaper, and I would take out a pen. You've heard of pens, and I would circle the ones that interested me, and then I would sit down and I would write. I did have a word processor and a printer, and I would write out cover letters, and I would send them my resume. And I would get responses. And the one that I took, because it seemed like the best opportunity, was with HP, working on their version of Unix in Phoenix. And I went to Phoenix, and you know, that was the moment when I left LA. I was about 35 years old at the time. And
so you packed in like a good life and a lot of stuff just in that 35
I have not covered
years.
A fraction of those stories.
I know, and
here.
that's what I'm saying. Like just in this episode by itself.
Well, when you consider the fact that I left at 12, and I left home at 12, and I lived in LA until I was 35, you know, that's 23 years. That is the story of me growing up in Hollywood.
Air quotes
because
again.
Because people, you know, they think of Los Angeles, and you know, they think of the Hollywood sign. They think of the tour buses.
I've taken my picture in front of that.
They think of the Grauman's Chinese Theater.
The Hollywood sign, not the buses.
Yeah, and you know, all of those things, and all of those things are, you know, in the movie studios. There's only one movie studio in Hollywood proper, and that's the Paramount. And I don't even know if they're still there. I know that that studio on Melrose is still there. I don't know if it's owned by Paramount anymore. And then there were TV studios. I worked for a while at KWHY in Hollywood, and there was CBS was in Hollywood, Channel 2. But most of them, you know, like Universal Studios is not in Hollywood. NBC is in Burbank, well, a beautiful downtown Burbank, as they call it. Fox is in Century City. There's Culver Studios, which I think used to be MGM. So, you know, most of them are not in Hollywood proper, but LA, people think of LA and they think of the Hollywood sign, you know. But anyway, that's that experience. How was that? Do you have any questions? Do you have any
No,
impressions?
I'm living through your starstruckedness.
Yeah.
Your fangirling.
Vicariously?
Yes, I am, because like I was saying earlier, I mean, we had somebody who was remotely famous show up to our high school reunion, and he was just like hanging out, chilling by himself. No, I wish. I didn't go to that school. Sorry.
Oh.
I say he's remotely famous. He's not that's big famous.
Who did she say? I didn't hear.
Post Malone.
Oh, okay. I've heard of him.
But that's not who I'm talking about.
I don't think I would recognize
He's
him
an
if I saw
up and coming country artist, and his face is all over Nashville. So I'd seen his face. He's married to a girl that I went to high school with, and he showed up at our high school reunion.
Wow.
And I was like, should
You
I go
going to
talk
say
to
who
him?
it is?
Yes, his name is Chris Colston.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
His name is Chris Colston.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's really cool, and I really love his music. He's awesome, and he was super sweet, but like my husband like played it super cool. He was like, hey man, they started talking about hunting, fishing, loving every day, you know. And then in comes me, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm such a big fan of your music. I see your face all over Nashville. I can't believe you're here right now. This is like the coolest thing. And like that's me. So like,
and he was cool.
and he was totally cool, and he was
that 5 times a day.
well, nobody else was coming
Yeah.
over to him, and so I just like, I don't know, it was an incredible experience, and he's super cool, and
Perhaps he's better known in Nashville. where there's
yes,
places all over the
absolutely,
world,
yeah, and you know, getting bigger in Texas, but he's got great music. This is free plug for you, I guess, but that's how I imagine you like fangirling over these people is just like the word vomit. So I've just been sitting here like imagining it in my head about you know, meeting all these people, and you know, you say starstruck, and I just imagine like woo, like a woo girl. So
well, what you call fangirling today, I think in my day was called starstruck.
yeah,
and you know, speechless and you know, hi, I'm such a fan.
I rarely come up speechless.
You
and
know,
I feel like that
growing
applies
up
to you.
in the city like that, I don't know, there's an understanding, there's an unspoken understanding that the stars don't really want to be called out,
Right.
and they don't really, you know, they'll sign things and they'll be polite, but they really just want to go about their day because they are just people
Right.
like, doing a job like the rest of us, you know, who happened to become very, very successful. Yeah, I'm getting the signal over here from our director, Ricky. She's given me the signal. It's
Flipping you
been
the bird.
great, folks.
Kirsten said that I was flipping you the bird.
Oh, yeah. That definitely happens.
That was the signal.
That happens more than you would know. But, or, you know, as I used to say, this is the feather. It's for people who don't deserve the whole bird.
Right. I love that.
Yeah.
That should be our new sign off.
Nope, we're going to keep the same sign off that we've had. It's all done. Jazz hands.
He said, I'm all that.
Yeah. Good night, y'all. This podcast is copyright 2023 by the Bearheart Group, LLC. Bearheart Labs is a brand of the Bearheart Group, and our podcasts are produced at our studios here in fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. Our podcast producer is Rickiana Denning, a.k.a. Ricky. Our co-host and hardworking administrator is Kirsten Hilgendorf, and I'm Bearheart. On behalf of all of us here at Bearheart Labs, thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope to have you back again soon.